Welcome to Wisdom for the Present, where we take ancient truth and bring it into clear, modern understanding. This episode uses AI-generated narration based on human research and written material.
Glad to be here.
So, what if the most famous cautionary tale about, reckless teenagers isn't actually a cautionary tale at all?
Right.
I mean, think about the way we normally talk about William Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet. We treat it as the story of two foolish, highly dramatic kids who just make impulsive decisions.
Right. They get swept up in a toxic infatuation and meet this completely preventable, tragic end.
Exactly. It's practically a cultural cliche at this point to view their love as a sort of naive liability.
Yeah.
Like a warning about the dangers of youthful impulsivity. But today, we are diving into a text that argues our cynical, modern perspective on this play has completely missed the point.
Entirely missed it, yeah.
We are exploring a seminal commentary by the 19th century essayist and critic William Hazlitt. And our mission today is to look far beyond the whole star-crossed lovers trope, right? To extract the profound psychological truths Hazlitt uncovers in Shakespeare's text.
Which are pretty mind-blowing when you get into them.
They really are. We want to understand what this play actually teaches us about the raw nature of youth, the mechanics of human imagination, and, honestly, the terrifying vulnerability of pure passion.
It is a profound shift in perspective. I mean, Hazlitt's analysis fundamentally challenges some deeply ingrained assumptions we hold about emotion and maturity.
Yeah.
We're going to examine why he views this play not as some silly romance, but as the perfect distillation of the buoyant spirit of youth.
I love that phrase.
Right. And we'll look at how he dismantles the prevailing cynicism toward teenage emotion, including this rather ferocious critique of famous philosophers like William Wordsworth.
Oh, yeah, he really goes after him.
He does. He hates their melancholic views on childhood. But most importantly, we're going to unpack what Juliet's uncensored, absolute passion reveals about the lengths we go to in modern society to avoid vulnerability.
To protect ourselves, basically.
Exactly. Hazlitt makes this compelling case that Shakespeare was charting a perfectly accurate map of human nature, specifically how we experience hope and desire before the world teaches us to be afraid.
Man, that dynamic, experiencing the world before it teaches you to be afraid, is something that touches all of us.
Absolutely.
Whether you consider yourself a romantic, a hardened cynic, or just someone trying to navigate the complexities of, human emotion.
Because we live in a culture that heavily rewards playing it safe.
We really do. We are taught from a very young age to manage our expectations, to build walls, to guard our hearts, and to view extreme passion as almost a psychological defect, like we pathologize it.
We call it a red flag.
Yes. And I think that's why the common modern assumption is that Romeo and Juliet is just this melodramatic, overly sentimental story. It feels akin to those cheap, sugary romantic comedies you might watch on an airplane.
The ones that are sweet enough to give you a cavity?
Exactly. But entirely disconnected from the reality of adult life. It feels sickly sweet.
Well, that sickly sweet assumption is precisely the target Hazlitt goes after right out of the gate in his commentary.
Okay, let's hear it.
He insists that this play is absolutely not sickly, and it is entirely devoid of cheap sentimentality.
Really?
Yeah, he brings up a quote from another critic of his era who claimed the play has everything intoxicating about a southern spring or the first opening of a rose.
This feels pretty sentimental so far.
Right, but Hazlitt agrees with the imagery while arguing that the critic misses the underlying vitality. Hazlitt writes, let me find it. He says, "For if it has the sweetness of the rose, it has its freshness too."
Oh, freshness.
Right. If it has the languor of the nightingale song, it has also its rapturous intoxications. He vehemently denies that the story possesses a sickly and sentimental cast. Instead, he defines the core of the play as the high and healthy pulse of the passions.
Wait, the high and healthy pulse.
Yep.
That phrase just stops you in your tracks. Because when we talk about young love or any kind of overwhelming romantic obsession, we almost exclusively use the language of disease.
You absolutely do.
We call it being lovesick.
Yeah.
We talk about having a fever that needs to break so the person can come back to their senses and return to normal, rational functioning.
Like it's a temporary madness.
Exactly. But Hazlitt completely flips that paradigm. He is arguing that this extreme consuming passion isn't a sickness at all.
It's the exact opposite.
It's the pulse of life operating at its absolute peak health.
Right. The blood is fully circulating, the heart is beating at its most vital rhythm. He specifically contrasts their love with what he calls the insipid interchange of sentiments lip deep.
Oh,
Yeah, learnt at secondhand from poems and plays.
So he's taking aim at the artificiality of the romances popular in his own era.
Exactly. But the critique applies just as cleanly to our modern world. He's targeting the kind of love that is essentially performative.
You know the type, where love is depicted as this fragile, delicate, highly curated thing.
Right. That, in Hazlitt's words, shrinks from the touch and represents an elaborate vacuity of thought.
Wow. Elaborate vacuity of thought. That is quite an insult.
He had a way with words. But his point is that Romeo and Juliet are not just reciting lines they learn from a culture that expects them to act romantically.
They aren't performing.
No, they are experiencing the raw, original, untamed fire of human connection. And this establishes his defense against the critics who dismiss their connection as a mere idle passion.
Right, because that is the most common critique you hear. People look at the plot and say, well, this is an idle passion between a boy and a girl who have barely spoken to each other.
They've known each other for, what, 2 days?
Exactly. They have absolutely no life experience. They don't know what real hardship is. They haven't paid a mortgage.
Right. They haven't endured long-term suffering.
Therefore, their rapturous joy and their suicidal despair are totally groundless. It's fantastical nonsense.
It is the classic adult dismissal. You kids don't know what real love is.
Yeah. So how does Hazlitt dismantle that? Because, I mean, on a practical level, the critics are right. They don't have experience.
They don't have experience, and Hazlitt says that is precisely the engine of their passion.
Wait, really?
Yeah. His counter-argument provides this transformative insight into how human desire actually functions. He starts by looking at how other writers and artists attempt to depict deep feeling.
Okay.
He notes that many authors try to do things backwards. They try to show a first love somehow miraculously maintained into extreme old age.
Right.
Or they try to depict passion springing up on the rebound after its initial natural force has already been spent.
Like trying to reignite a burnt-out match?
Exactly. And Hazlitt argues that Shakespeare recognized the futility of that approach. Shakespeare didn't try to extract beauty from wrinkles or the wild throb of passion from the last expiring sigh of indifference.
He didn't try to gather grapes from thorns.
Right. He simply showed human life operating in the natural order of its progression. And the core wisdom Hazlitt extracts is this. The lover's passion is not based on the pleasures they have experienced.
Okay.
It is fueled entirely by all the pleasures they had not experienced.
Wow. Their passion isn't based on what they've experienced. It's based on all the pleasures they had not experienced.
Yes.
That completely alters the way we value life events.
Right.
Because we have this societal assumption that experience is the absolute prerequisite for emotional depth.
Right.
We assume you must have lived a long time, suffered greatly, and seen the complexities of the world to feel things deeply.
But Hazlitt is arguing that youth is the season of absolute, unbridled love exactly because the heart is melted by the touch of novelty.
It hasn't encountered limits yet.
No, it hasn't hit a wall. Hazlitt writes that passion, the love and expectation of pleasure, is infinite, extravagant, inexhaustible, till experience comes to check and kill it.
Jeez. Till experience comes to check and kill it.
It's a sobering thought, isn't it?
Very. But psychologically, it is incredibly accurate. When you have no experience of failure or betrayal, or even just the mundane realities of long-term existence, your capacity to imagine a perfect future is boundless.
Yeah. Hazlitt describes this phenomenon beautifully. He says, at that untried source of promised happiness, they slaked their thirst, and the first eager drop made them drunk with love and joy.
The intoxication comes from the fact that it is untried.
Exactly.
You know, I think of it like someone who has lived their entire life completely landlocked, who has never seen the ocean.
Right.
They've only heard stories, maybe seen a few paintings, but their imagination of what the sea feels like, sounds like, and smells like is just massive.
Yeah, they have this huge buildup.
And then finally, they are driving toward the coast. They roll down the window and catch that first distinct scent of salt in the air. The anticipation, the absolute intoxicating thrill of that untried source is overwhelming.
Their mind is racing with infinite possibilities.
Exactly. Now put that person next to a seasoned veteran sailor who has crossed the Atlantic 1,000 times.
Right. Totally different experience.
The sailor has deep, profound knowledge. The sailor knows the currents, respects the deadly storms, understands the tides.
But the sailor does not have that electric, infinite, trembling thrill of the first sight.
Right. The sailor has experience, but the traveler has an imagination that is boundless because it is unburdened by reality.
Hazlitt captures this perfectly when he says of Romeo and Juliet, their hopes were of air, their desires of fire.
That ocean analogy illustrates the exact psychological mechanism Hazlitt's detailing here. I mean, when Juliet famously declares, "My bounty is as boundless as the sea, my love is deep," Hazlitt asks the reader, and why shouldn't it be?
Yeah. What is there in her mind to stop that thrilling tide of pleasure?
Nothing. Experience hasn't taught her to hold back.
She hasn't learned the modern survival tactic of indifference.
Which we are all so good at.
We really are. She hasn't felt the crushing weight of chronic disappointment. Her hopes are absolute. But we have to recognize that this operates as a double-edged sword.
Oh, for sure.
Which is vital for understanding the tragedy of the play. Because their hopes are absolute, their vulnerability to disappointment is equally absolute.
Right.
The transition they make from the highest possible bliss to the absolute lowest despair is instantaneous because they lack shock absorbers.
They don't have the cynicism or the broader perspective of age to tell them, well, time heals all wounds.
Or there are plenty of fish in the sea.
Exactly. Hazlitt points out that the only evil that actually befalls them in their own minds is the loss of the greatest possible felicity.
And that loss is fatal.
They would literally rather part with life itself than survive the loss of the only thing that made life dear to them.
Yeah, to them, surviving the loss isn't a victory of resilience. It is a living death.
They haven't been ground down by the slow attrition of life that teaches you how to compartmentalize grief.
Right, and Hazlitt suggests this isn't a flaw in their character. It is the natural reality of a mind not yet reduced to habitual impressions.
Which brings us to a really fascinating piece of historical and human context. Because Hazlitt wasn't writing these observations in a vacuum, was he?
No, not at all. He was actively engaging in a fierce philosophical debate with other intellectuals of his day about the fundamental nature of humanity, the purpose of art, and how we conceptualize childhood.
And he uses Shakespeare as his primary weapon in these debates.
Oh, absolutely. We see Hazlitt drawing a very sharp line between Shakespeare's approach to human nature and the approach favored by his contemporaries. For instance, he takes direct aim at the popular German dramas of his time.
Right.
He specifically cites a play called The Stranger. Hazlitt criticizes these works for trying to force profound philosophy by operating by contraries.
By contraries, what does he mean by that?
Like, they would try to manufacture deep sentiment by placing the wild throb of youthful passion into the context of old age or chronic indifference.
Like trying to make it weird to make it deep.
Exactly. And Hazlitt argues that Shakespeare's method is infinitely more powerful precisely because it doesn't force nature into an artificial philosophical framework. Shakespeare just observes nature as it exists and puts it on stage. He lets youth be youth.
But the most intense and revealing philosophical brawl in this entire commentary happens when Hazlitt takes on the legendary poet William Wordsworth.
Oh, this is my favorite part.
It's so good.
Yes.
And this dispute touches on something profound that many of us still unconsciously believe about childhood and aging.
Definitely.
Hazlitt brings up Wordsworth's incredibly famous ode on the progress of life, which most people know as the Ode. Intimations of Immortality.
Right.
In that poem, Wordsworth tackles the universal feeling that everything seems wildly vivid and magical when we are children. But as we grow up, that vividness fades into what he calls the light of common day.
And Wordsworth uses a framework deeply influenced by Platonism to explain why childhood feels so magical.
Right. He essentially argues that human souls existed in a perfect, celestial state like in heaven before we were born.
So when we are infants and young children, we are still trailing clouds of glory.
Trailing clouds of glory, we still retain a subconscious memory of heaven.
Yeah. Therefore, our early joy and the vividness of our thoughts are actually reflections of former trails of glory, shadows of our past being.
So for Wordsworth, childhood joy is an act of looking backward at a lost perfection.
Right. And Hazlitt's response to this sweeping, romantic, Platonic vision is wonderfully blunt and fiercely pragmatic.
What is he saying?
He simply states, this is idle.
Just, this is idle.
Yeah. He completely and utterly rejects these mystical visions of Platonism. He argues that we do not need to invent an imaginary pre-existent state in heaven to explain why teenagers and children experience the world with such overwhelming enthusiasm.
So what's his theory?
Well, his counter theory is a monumental shift in how we understand human psychology. He argues that the gloss and splendor of our first impressions do not come from our subconscious knowledge of the past.
Okay.
They come entirely from our ignorance of the future.
Let's really dig into the mechanics of that argument because it completely changes the origin point of human joy. Hazlitt says the obscurity of the future fills the void to come with the warmth of our desires.
Think about the psychological physics of his claim here. If the future is completely unknown to you, as it is to a youth, it acts as a massive blank canvas.
Right.
And what is the natural human impulse when faced with a blank canvas?
We project our greatest desires onto it.
Exactly. We paint our gayest hopes and our brightest fancies on that empty space. And Hazlitt uses one of the most stunning visual metaphors in the entire text to explain this.
Lay it on me.
He says the obscurity spread before life is the cloud which reflects the rainbow.
The cloud which reflects the rainbow.
Wow.
Yeah. The beauty, the rainbow isn't coming from some mystical celestial heaven trailing behind us. It is being projected forward by the light of our own human desires onto the unknown cloud of the future.
That is so powerful.
He argues forcefully that there is no need to plant the root of hope in the grave or to derive it from the skies. Its root is planted firmly in the physical, beating heart of man.
This specific debate has massive implications for how you view your own life trajectory. I mean, it might sound like two 19th century intellectuals just arguing over poetic theory, but it fundamentally shifts where we locate the source of our vitality.
Absolutely.
If Wordsworth's Platonism is right, then your best days are inherently and permanently behind you.
You're just decaying.
Exactly. You are constantly moving further away from the light, deteriorating from a state of innate childhood perfection into the dull, exhausting reality of the common day.
It forces you into a fundamentally nostalgic, melancholic relationship with your own existence.
You are always mourning a lost innocence.
Yeah.
But if Hazlitt is right, the engine of joy is not memory.
Wow.
It is imagination. It is desire. It is the present moment actively looking forward.
Exactly. It means the heaven that lies about us in our infancy, as Hazlitt phrases it, isn't a memory of the afterlife. It's just a brand new world of which we know absolutely nothing.
So we naturally believe it will be whatever we most wish it to be.
That is the essential modern translation of this text right there. Hazlitt asks, what is it that in youth sheds a dewy light round the evening star? That makes the daisy look so bright, that perfumes the hyacinth, that embalms the first kiss of love.
His answer.
His answer is clear. He says, it is the delight of novelty, and the seeing no end to the pleasure that we fondly believe is still in store for us. He is arguing that the human soul comes into the world in utter nakedness. It is not trailing clouds of celestial glory.
It is a blank slate.
Yes. Love and passion wait for the physical, earthly ripening of youthful blood. The raw, physical sense of pleasure precedes the intellectual love of pleasure.
And once that physical sense of pleasure makes contact with the world, the infinite desires are unleashed. This framework makes perfect sense of why Romeo and Juliet behave with such terrifying intensity. They aren't trying to recapture a fading memory of a past heaven.
No.
They are actively trying to construct a future heaven out of pure, unadulterated imagination and immediate physical sensation.
Which brings us to a major obstacle to growth, doesn't it? Both historically and right now in our modern culture.
It does. We need to talk about Juliet's voice, because historically, her complete lack of censorship has been viewed as deeply threatening.
Yeah, this is where we encounter the censorship of purity. Hazlitt points out a specific, vital passage from the play that was actively being censored during his era.
Which one?
It's Juliet's famous soliloquy that occurs right after her secret marriage to Romeo. She's alone in her room, waiting for the sun to set so Romeo can come to her to consummate the marriage.
Oh, the gallop apace speech.
That's the one. She begins, "Gallop apace, you fiery-footed steeds, towards Phoebus's mansion." She is passionately begging for nightfall. She speaks of love performing night and laments that she has bought the mansion of a love, but not possessed it.
Right. It is a speech of pure, unfiltered, trembling anticipation for her wedding night. She compares her feeling to an impatient child who's been given new robes but is not yet allowed to wear them.
It is an incredibly visceral, honest expression of female physical desire. But what happened to this speech in the 19th century?
Well, Hazlitt notes, with a palpable sense of disgust, that he deliberately inserts this passage into his commentary because he has no doubt it has been expunged from the family Shakespeare.
Expunged. We need a quick bit of historical context here to understand the gravity of that. The family Shakespeare was a highly popular edition of the plays published by a man named Thomas Bowdler.
Yes.
In fact, this is exactly where we get the word Bowdlerize, which means to remove material that is considered improper or offensive.
He literally took a red pen to Shakespeare.
He did. Bowdler went through Shakespeare's texts and deleted everything he deemed inappropriate for women and children to read. He read Juliet's honest, desperate anticipation of her wedding night, and he saw it as dirty.
He saw it as immodest. He viewed female desire, expressed so openly, as a threat to moral order.
And Hazlitt absolutely eviscerates these censors. He writes, "Such critics do not perceive that the feelings of the heart sanctify without disguising the impulses of nature."
Sanctify without disguising.
Yeah. He goes on to say, "Without refinement themselves, they confound modesty with hypocrisy."
Wow, they confound modesty with hypocrisy.
It strikes at the core of how society defines innocence and purity. The censors operated on the assumption that true modesty meant either not possessing physical desires at all, or at the very least, possessing the hypocritical skill to pretend you didn't have them.
Right, keeping up appearances.
Exactly. Hazlitt, referencing the German critic Schlegel, argues the exact opposite. He quotes Schlegel, who said that Shakespeare managed to unite purity of heart and the glow of imagination and passionate violence in one ideal picture.
I really want to pause on that phrase, passionate violence. It is such a jarring, almost contradictory set of words to place right next to purity of heart.
It is.
But it works perfectly to describe Juliet. Hazlitt's analysis of her psychology here is razor sharp. He points out that her character has nothing forward, nothing coy, nothing affected or coquettish about it.
Right.
It is the pure manifestation of nature. She is completely frank precisely because she is modest. She has absolutely no thought that she feels the need to conceal.
She rests in what Hazlitt boldly calls conscious innocence on the strength of its affections.
Conscious innocence is the operative phrase. Her delicacy does not consist of coldness or an artificial reserve. Her purity is the combination of a profoundly warm imagination, a tender heart, and what Hazlitt refers to as the most voluptuous sensibility.
Love acts as a flame that expands her entire being.
Yeah.
Shakespeare even weaves this into the observations of the other characters.
Oh, really?
Yeah, when Juliet approaches Friar Lawrence's cell, the friar remarks that her foot is so light it would never wear out the flint. He suggests she could bestride a gossamer spider web floating in the summer air and not fall.
Because she is born entirely upon the buoyant thoughts of love. If we translate the mechanics of this censorship to the 21st century, it becomes incredibly relevant to you listening right now. The obstacle today isn't a man named Thomas Bowdler physically cutting pages out of our books.
No, we do it to ourselves.
Today, the censorship is internal. It is cultural. We still hide our true, overwhelming excitement, but we do it under thick layers of irony and performative distance.
We have an absolute cultural obsession with being cool.
Right. Think about the modern rules of dating. If you go on a date and have a wonderful time, the unspoken rule is often that you must wait 3 days to text the person back.
Right, the 3-day rule.
You cannot double text. You must not seem too eager.
You have to hide your desire.
Because we operate on a bizarre power dynamic where whoever cares less holds the power.
It's toxic.
To be as utterly sincere and as physically and emotionally present as Juliet is in that soliloquy feels dangerously vulnerable in our current climate. It almost feels radical.
It does. We confound modesty with playing strategic games in the exact same way the 19th century censors confounded modesty with hypocrisy.
That is a direct parallel. We are terrified of being perceived as too much.
We're terrified of the rejection that might follow if we show our full hand.
So we intentionally manufacture that elaborate vacuity of thought Hazlitt warned about. We perform indifference as a defense mechanism.
Juliet entirely refuses to do that.
Yeah.
And the wisdom Hazlitt offers here is that true purity is not the absence of passion. It is the honest, uncensored expression of it when it is aligned completely with the genuine feelings of the heart.
However, we have to look at the other side of the coin.
We do.
There's a deeply dark, incredibly dangerous side to this total immersion in passion. Hazlitt does not just offer blind praise. He demands wisdom with discernment.
Right, because as much as he elevates this absolute devotion, he also highlights the terrifying psychological reality of what Romeo and Juliet are actually doing to themselves.
And to explain this, Hazlitt makes a comparative insight that is arguably the most fascinating point in his entire commentary.
I love this part.
He writes, simply, Romeo is Hamlet in love.
Romeo is Hamlet in love. It is one of the most arresting and counterintuitive sentences in the text.
Because on the surface, these two characters seem to be polar opposites.
Exactly. I mean, Hamlet is the ultimate, brooding, indecisive, melancholic intellectual who can't bring himself to act. Romeo is the ultimate, impulsive, hyper-emotional lover who acts before he thinks.
Right.
But Hazlitt asks us to look at the psychological architecture that links them. He argues that there is the exact same rich exuberance of passion and sentiment in Romeo that there is of thought and intellect in Hamlet.
Ah, okay.
Both men are fundamentally absent and self-involved. Both of them, crucially, live out of themselves in a world of imagination.
That concept, living out of themselves in a world of imagination, is the key. Because Hamlet is completely abstracted from everything.
Right.
He is trapped in a mental labyrinth, analyzing the universe, life, and death to the point of total paralysis. He's unable to engage with the physical reality right in front of him.
And Romeo, Hazlitt points out, is equally abstracted from reality.
Yes.
The difference is that Romeo is abstracted from everything except his love, and he is totally, completely lost inside it.
Romeo's entire sense of self is displaced. He is only himself when he is in Juliet.
Exactly. She becomes his only reality, his heart's true home and idol.
And the rest of the world, the feud between their families, the politics of Verona, the danger to his own life, it all becomes just a passing dream to him.
His reality is fashioned entirely out of the suggestions of hope and the flatteries of his own imagination. Hazlitt quotes the scene where Romeo is in exile in Mantua just before he receives the devastating news of Juliet's supposed death.
What happens in that scene?
Well, Romeo says his dreams presage joyful news, that his bosom's lord sits lightly on his throne, and he describes a dream where Juliet came and found him dead and breathed life into him with kisses. He is living entirely inside a constructed, hermetically sealed reality of his own absolute devotion.
This is where we must exercise discernment. While the soaring poetry is beautiful, and the purity of that devotion is breathtaking to watch on a stage, staking your entire connection to reality, your entire existential weight on a single human being is incredibly perilous.
It's a recipe for disaster.
If you apply this blindly to your own life, if you make another person your soul tethered to the earth, it is psychological destruction. It is the ultimate form of codependency.
Hazlitt himself identifies the fatal boundary here. He says the only evil that actually befalls them is the loss of the greatest possible felicity.
Right.
But because their entire world, their entire psychological architecture is built only on the foundation of each other, the loss of that foundation is instantly fatal.
They do not have a self to fall back on.
No, they would rather die than survive the loss of what made life dear.
We have to be able to appreciate the staggering beauty of this absolute devotion in literature, while clearly recognizing its tragic, destructive boundary in real life.
And Shakespeare layers that psychological complexity with a detail early in the play that modern audiences almost always struggle with.
Oh, I know what you're going to say.
The character of Rosaline.
Yes, the Rosaline problem. I will admit, this always bothered me when reading the play.
Bothers everyone.
Right. Because at the very beginning, before Romeo ever sets eyes on Juliet, he is wandering around the sycamore grove, absolutely devastated.
Yeah, he's crying, sighing, locking himself in his darkened room.
Being incredibly dramatic because he is desperately, hopelessly in love with a girl named Rosaline, who has sworn to remain chaste and does not love him back.
He claims he will never see anyone as beautiful as her.
And then he crashes the Capulet party, sees Juliet from across the room, and instantly, within a millisecond, forgets Rosaline even exists.
Just poof. Gone.
From a modern perspective, doesn't this make Romeo seem wildly fickle? Like he is just a serial romantic who falls obsessively in love with whoever happens to be standing in front of him.
It is the most common critique of Romeo's character, but Hazlitt mounts a brilliant defense of this choice.
Let's say, Sam.
He notes that Romeo's passion for Juliet succeeds and drives out his previous passion for Rosaline as the sun hides the stars.
As the sun hides the stars.
Yes. Hazlitt views this not as a flaw in Romeo's sincerity, but as a deliberate and masterful artifice by Shakespeare. It is not strictly necessary for the plot mechanics, but it serves a vital psychological purpose.
Which is?
Well, first, Hazlitt argues, it actually enhances the immense richness of the prize, which is Juliet. The fact that her mere presence is so overwhelming that it instantaneously annihilates a deep, brooding depression over another woman proves how uniquely powerful Juliet is.
Oh, I see. It's like Rosaline was a star.
Right.
Romeo was staring at her in the night sky.
Yeah.
And because she was the only point of light he was focused on, he genuinely thought she was the brightest thing in the universe.
Yeah.
But then Juliet walks in, and she is the sun. When the sun rises, the stars don't cease to exist, but their light is completely obliterated by the sheer magnitude of the sun. You don't even notice them anymore.
That is the exact dynamic. Furthermore, Hazlitt points out that the inclusion of Rosaline shows the commencement, progress, and ending of a second passion that is entirely complete in itself.
The love for Juliet is not injured or lessened by the fact that he thought he loved Rosaline.
Exactly. If anything, the stark contrast shows the qualitative difference between a melancholy, one-sided, imaginative infatuation and a true, reciprocal, life-altering connection.
It highlights Romeo's transition from the world of Hamlet-like moody abstraction, where he was just in love with the idea of being in love with Rosalind.
Into the vivid, vital, dangerous, shared reality with Juliet.
Right. And Shakespeare doesn't just isolate this passion in a vacuum. He builds an incredibly dense, realistic world around them to give their emotions scale and weight.
He really does.
Which brings us to the mastermind of the poet. Hazlitt describes the play as a beautiful coup d'oeil, a comprehensive glance of the entire progress of human life.
It's not just a play about youth.
No. It is a play about the entire cycle of existence. Shakespeare places this blinding, youthful passion against a backdrop of aging and decay.
Yeah.
We see Juliet grow up through the rambling, idle prattle of the nurse, who remembers weaning her. We see Lady Capulet reflecting on her own youth, noting that she was roughly Juliet's age when she became a mother herself.
And then you have the far end of the spectrum, represented by the older generation, specifically old Capulet.
Right.
There is this brilliant moment at the masquerade ball where Capulet is watching the young people dance. He turns to his elderly relative and starts reminiscing about his own youth.
That does he say.
He somewhat impatiently recalls, "I've seen the day that I have worn a visor and could tell a whispering tale in a fair lady's ear, such as would please. 'Tis gone, 'tis gone.
'Tis gone, 'tis gone, 'tis gone." There is an immense, heavy grief in that repetition.
There is. Hazlitt points out how Shakespeare uses these moments to illustrate the relentless generational push of time.
Right.
One period of life makes way for the following, and one generation physically pushes another off the stage.
And against the melancholic backdrop of Capulet's fading memories, the explosive feelings of youth and spring are thrust to the forefront.
Yeah, Hazlitt notes how images of vernal beauty float in profusion throughout the text. When Capulet invites Paris to his house, he promises him he will see earth-treading stars that make dark heaven light.
Comparing the delight Paris will feel to the joy lusty young men feel when well-appareled April on the heel of limping winter treads.
The entire atmospheric world of the play is governed by these sharp contrasts: winter and spring, age and youth, dark night and blinding torches.
And it isn't just contrasting physical ages. Shakespeare is deliberately contrasting moralities and worldviews. Hazlitt specifically defends Shakespeare's inclusion of low characters in the play. He notes that some fastidious critics view characters like the nurse or Mercutio as deformities that distract from the high poetry of the romance.
Which is such a bad read.
It is. Hazlitt argues they are completely wrong. These characters are the source of 1,000 beauties. And the most powerful example he provides is the sharp contrast between Juliet's absolute guileless devotion and the character of the nurse.
Oh, the nurse is an endlessly fascinating figure.
She is.
For much of the play, she provides immense comic relief. She is bawdy, talkative, and deeply affectionate toward Juliet. But in the critical turning point moment of the play, she becomes the mouthpiece for something deeply cynical.
Right. This is after Romeo is banished for killing Tybalt, and Juliet is being aggressively forced by her parents to marry Paris.
Juliet turns to her lifelong confidant, the nurse, for comfort and help.
And the nurse, employing what Hazlitt calls convenient policy, essentially tells Juliet to give up.
She says, in effect, look, Romeo is banished. He is as good as dead. He can't help you here. Paris is a handsome gentleman, a better match anyway. Just marry Paris.
The nurse represents the voice of societal compromise. She is like that well-meaning but incredibly cynical friend who, when you are facing a massive crisis of the heart, advises you to just settle for the safe bet.
Exactly.
The nurse is literally advising Juliet to commit bigamy, to betray her husband, and to betray her own soul, simply because it is easier and more socially convenient.
It is the ultimate pragmatic, survivalist advice of the adult world.
And Juliet's reaction is explosive and definitive. She waits until the nurse leaves the room and then declares, "Ancient damnation, oh, most wicked fiend."
Chills.
It is a furious, absolute rejection of moral compromise. It's the ultimate defense of true honor over convenient policy.
And by placing that cynical pragmatism right next to Juliet's pure devotion, Shakespeare radically elevates the tragedy. We suddenly see the massive forces Juliet is up against.
She isn't just fighting the feud, and she isn't just fighting her parents' authority. She is fighting the mundane, compromising, soul-crushing nature of the adult world itself.
And this kind of structural genius is embedded everywhere in the text. Hazlitt also points out how Shakespeare expertly handles the plausibility of the plot.
Oh, this is important.
Right, because the central mechanism of the tragedy, Juliet taking a mysterious sleeping potion that perfectly mimics death for exactly 2 and 40 hours, could easily seem incredibly improbable.
Yeah, like something out of a cheap fantasy novel.
But Shakespeare softens this improbability from the very beginning.
How does he manage to make us believe in the potion? It does seem like it should break the grounded reality of the play.
He does it by introducing Friar Lawrence early on, long before the potion is ever needed for the plot.
Okay.
When we first meet the friar, he is out at dawn culling simples, gathering herbs, weeds, and plants, and descanting on their potent virtues and deadly properties.
Right. He delivers that long philosophical speech about how the earth is both nature's mother and her tomb.
And how inside the rind of a single tiny flower resides both poison and medicine.
Yes. By establishing the friar's deep, almost alchemical expertise in botany and chemistry so early, the extreme, almost magical element of the sleeping potion later on is firmly grounded in a believable physical reality.
A reality that has already been meticulously built for the audience.
He anchors the soaring, almost supernatural poetry in the literal dirt and roots of the earth.
Oh,
It is brilliant craftsmanship.
it really is.
And speaking of grounding extreme emotion in reality, we need to look at how these characters actually process the horrific realities they face.
Yeah.
Because the play is not just a steady, uninterrupted stream of pure love. They get hit with massive, life-altering trauma. Specifically, I want to look at the scene where Juliet finds out that Romeo has just murdered her cousin, Tybalt.
This scene is a masterclass in the fluidity and chaos of human emotion.
It's so intense.
Hazlitt highlights this specific moment to show how natural and overpowering Shakespeare's grasp of human psychology truly is. He points out that Shakespeare doesn't just show us the force of one single passion operating in a vacuum.
Right.
He shows us the slightest and most unlooked-for transitions from one to another, the mingling currents of every different feeling rising up and prevailing in turn.
The mingling currents of every different feeling, that describes cognitive dissonance so perfectly.
Go ahead.
Because when Juliet first hears the news that her new husband has killed her beloved cousin, her initial reaction is profound horror and anger directed at Romeo.
She unleashes a torrent of oxymorons, calling him a beautiful tyrant and a fiend angelical.
She even encourages the nurse to shame him. The nurse says, "Shame come to Romeo." And for a split second, Juliet is aligned with that anger. But the absolute instant the nurse articulates that curse, Juliet's internal current shifts violently.
She instantly repels the very wish she herself had just occasioned.
She turns fiercely on the nurse and says, "Blistered be thy tongue for such a wish. He was not born to shame. Upon his brow shame is ashamed to sit."
And then we watch her catch herself in this agonizing cognitive dissonance. She asks herself, oh, what a beast was I to chide him so?
And the nurse asks the logical, pragmatic question, "Will you speak well of him that killed your cousin?"
And Juliet answers with an irrefutable logic of the heart. Shall I speak ill of him that is my husband?
Wow. Think about how this applies to how we handle conflicting, powerful emotions in real time. Juliet is modeling the messy, contradictory reality of the human heart in crisis.
She loves her cousin deeply, and she loves her husband who just murdered her cousin.
The profound practice here is that she doesn't try to suppress one feeling to make the narrative neat and tidy. She allows herself to feel the profound shock, the bitter anger, and the sense of betrayal.
But ultimately, she actively chooses where her deepest devotion lies.
As Hazlitt notes, passion, after the initial shock of surprise is past, throws its entire weight into the scale of her affections. Her ultimate loyalty governs the chaos of her conflicting emotions.
And it is that absolute, unyielding loyalty that carries her all the way to the tomb.
Let's talk about the tomb scene.
Hazlitt's description of the final tragic scene in the Capulet monument is incredibly moving. He discusses how Romeo's actions echo Juliet's frantic grief.
He mentions the legendary stage performance of Mr. Kean, right? The famous actor in Hazlitt's time.
Yes, noting how Kean delivered the word banished in an earlier scene with such overwhelming force that his acting treads close indeed upon the genius of his author.
High praise.
But Hazlitt spends significant time analyzing the profound poetry of Romeo's final speech before he drinks the poison.
Let's look closely at that final speech. Romeo breaks into the tomb, fights and kills Paris, and then finds what he believes is Juliet's dead body. But he is struck by how incredibly vital and beautiful she still looks. He says, "Death that hath sucked the honey of thy breath hath had no power yet upon thy beauty, Thou art not conquered, beauty's ensign yet is crimson in thy lips and in thy cheeks, and death's pale flag is not advanced there.
The dramatic irony is excruciating.
It really is.
Because the audience knows she still looks alive because she is alive. The potion is merely wearing off.
But Romeo, trapped in his abstraction, reasons that because she looks so vital, the lean, abhorred monster of death must have kept her there in the dark to be his paramour.
And to protect her from death, Romeo resolves to stay with her forever in the tomb, to set up his everlasting rest and shake the yoke of inauspicious stars from this world-wearied flesh.
Hazlitt is so moved by this passage that he compares this description of Juliet's loveliness in death to Shakespeare's famous lines about Cleopatra after her death.
Right, where Cleopatra looked as though she were sleeping, waiting to catch another Antony in her strong toil of grace.
And Hazlitt poses a critical question. Which of those two descriptions is finer? The pure crimson beauty of Juliet, or the majestic fatal grace of Cleopatra?
And his conclusion is the ultimate testament to Shakespeare's unparalleled genius.
What does he say?
He says, we can more easily decide between Shakespeare and any other author than between him and himself.
That is beautifully put. And it brings us to a final reflection for you to consider in your own daily life. We have spent this time exploring Hazlitt's defense of the high and healthy pulse of passion.
We have examined the infinite, intoxicating hope of the untried source,
The terrifying psychological danger of total abstraction.
and the radical courage required to express uncensored emotion.
So the question you have to ask yourself is, are you allowing yourself to experience the high and healthy pulse of your own passion?
Or has experience, exactly as Hazlitt warned, come to check and kill it?
When you look ahead at the unknown future, do you just see a dark void to fear? Or do you possess the imagination to see the cloud which reflects the rainbow?
Think about how this shifts where you find your deepest joys.
How can you approach your life, your relationships, and your work with the untried hope of Juliet, rather than retreating into the safe, elaborate vacuity and the artificial dearth of modern cynicism?
It requires a terrifying amount of vulnerability to live that way.
It really does.
It requires stepping out from behind the heavy visor of age and experience that old Capulet wears, and risking the kind of absolute, undeniable commitment that actively defies the convenient policy of the nurse.
It means choosing the rawness of reality over the safety of irony. And as we wrap up this deep dive, there's a final provocative thought I want to leave you with, drawn right from the end of Hazlitt's commentary.
That's a great story.
Hazlitt shares a wonderful anecdote about a man named Mr. Sheridan, a playwright. Someone handed Sheridan a book titled The Beauties of Shakespeare, which was essentially a 19th century highlight reel.
Yeah.
It was just a collection of the best, most famous quotes pulled entirely out of their context. And upon looking at this single, thin volume of highlights, Sheridan simply asked, but where are the other 11?
The implication is profound. You cannot isolate the beauties from the whole.
You really can.
The context, the tragedy, the agonizing cognitive dissonance, the mundane low characters, the mingling currents of conflicting feeling, all of that is the beauty.
You cannot have the poetry without the pain that surrounds it. Exactly.
Yeah.
And in our modern age of endless summaries, of highlight reels on social media, of constant life hacks designed specifically to help us skip the hard, uncomfortable parts of existence, are we just skimming the beauties of life and missing the immense, messy, overpowering reality of the whole work?
That's the real question.
Are you just reading the safe highlights of your own life, protecting yourself from the depths, or are you brave enough to feel the full, unbroken text? Let that linger.
That's the heart of this section. This is Wisdom for the Present, where understanding leads to clarity, and clarity shapes how we see and live. We'll see you in the next episode.